Good morning, Caroline. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you. Caroline Bremner from Euromonitor International, based in Scotland, I think, Caroline.
That's right.
Part of the world I'm really anxious to get back to on the train, I hasten to add. I don't plan to fly. Caroline, you've recently published a report on sustainable tourism around the world, which you refer to as the white paper. Be really great this morning to hear you talk us through that. But before we go through that white paper, could you tell me what you think are the key things we need to be monitoring and reporting as we make our claims that we are making a more sustainable interest? What are the key indicators?
Well, that's a great question, Harold, and thank you so much for having me here this morning. I would say that there are many different aspects of sustainability that we need to measure, and by building this index, we were able to address some of that. And of course, I can walk you through the findings, and then we can also discuss those key criteria that are so important in terms of measurement and metrics.
Thanks, Caroline. So anybody who's watching this needs to watch till the end to get that really important information at the end of your interview. Great, let's get underway then.
Excellent. So I'm just sharing my screen now. Is that all?
It's perfect. Please go ahead. Great.
Great. So as I mentioned, we have developed a sustainable travel index, and this is very much based on the issues that we saw last year as a result of the pandemic and the need to to rebuild the travel and tourism industry. So I'm delighted that to share the results with you, discuss the methodology and the approach, and also talk about those metrics that you're so interested in, Harold, along with examples of best practice. So I would say, first of all, just a quick introduction to Euromonitor. We're a global market research company with offices in 15 locations around the world. And, I work with hundreds of analysts who, are very passionate about travel and tourism. And of course, with COVID, that global reach was so important to understanding the true costs and effects of COVID-19. So we have some brand new research on the consumer side, which I think really sets the scene before we dive into the index specifically. And so 66% of consumers globally want to have a positive impact on the environment through their daily actions. And that actually increased over last year to this year. So even in the midst of the worst pandemic in centuries, consumers show this very strong commitment to having that, positive effect. And I think this is so important. And I think it's also a really strong case for businesses to double down on their sustainability efforts.
Caroline, just before we move on, just on that figure, that's obviously a global average figure.
That's right.
What's the kind of range on that? I mean, I don't want you to tell me which is the worst country, but what's the kind of range around that 66%?
Well, the thing is, as you rightly say, it's an average. So for some countries, particularly in emerging markets, that figure is even higher. So we see, countries such as India or the Philippines, in Asian countries, Latin American countries, show a much higher interest in having a positive impact than, say, some of the advanced markets. And of course, in Europe, certain areas of Europe, like Scandinavia, are particularly driven by having a strong social and environmental impact. And then some others less so, particularly, for example, where we see the US that may be trailing behind. But that's not to say it's certain aspects, maybe the younger generations show more of an interest than others.
I think it's quite important takeaway that it is in those emerging markets in the Far East and South Asia that we're seeing quite strong support for this kind of positioning. It's not something which is necessarily confined to Europe and the developed countries. I think people need to remember that.
Yes.
That's
yes.
very helpful, Caroline. Thank you.
And actually, we have some more data to support that, in the presentation. And obviously, happy to discuss and share with anybody who's particularly interested in that.
Thanks, Caroline. We will make available a link to the
Mhm.
report when we publish this this video as well.
Excellent. Okay, so let's start with the index. And often the question is, well, why build an index? And for us, it was because we have so much data. And I just felt that it was, important for us to take a look at all the data that we had in-house and look at it through a sustainability lens to help travel businesses, DMOs, destinations to rebuild in the best way that is resilient and sustainable. And also, everybody in the industry, there was a sort of an elephant in the room before the pandemic, which was the fact, tourism is not always positive. And, we had over tourism, we had anti-tourism sentiment in certain destinations, very fragile locations being at high risk. And so we know that that volume driven model has really been sort of put on under the spotlight, and we can see that it isn't sustainable. Volume driven growth without thinking about the consequences on communities, on the environment, we can't go back to that. I think there's a global reckoning within the industry and equally by communities that we need to transition to this value driven business model. And I'm sure everybody would agree that we can't return to the crowds. It's not just because of COVID, it's also because of the environment and communities as well. So to build the index, we identified 7 key pillars. So environmental, social, and economic sustainability at the country level, equally, the risk factors, and then more direct influences that had stronger weighting, sustainable tourism demand, sustainable transport, and also lodging.
What
So
do you
7,
mean? Sorry,
yeah.
Caroline. What do you mean by sustainable demand?
Well, this is where we looked at the makeup of tourism demand,
Right.
the balance between. Actually, if I go forward a slide, I can show you in more detail. So this is, look within each pillar, there were then sort of sub levels and as I say, lots of indicators feeding into them. So these are, the environmental, social, economic sustainability pillars and the risk. So and then the sustainable tourism demand, we looked at resilience, which, as I said, was this balance between the value derived to the country by domestic tourism versus international, because we know that domestic has been this buffer in post COVID as countries opened up, that if you have the ability to tap into domestic, that's one way to move forward and create value for communities. And then value creation, this is where we took a stab at trying to understand, well, how much is being spent on a daily basis, also estimating potential leakage, how much revenue flight has there been abroad. And then also, again, we took a stab at sort of over tourism, looking at the balance between the population versus the visitors, and then also factoring in the density of the country as well. So, I mean, this is the thing. This is the first iteration of this index. And of course, we are very open to feedback and ways to refine this. But as I mentioned, it was taking what we have existing in Euromonitor and then trying to apply it and work with it as much as possible to see, well, how can we gauge the level of sustainability in each country? And then, for example, the sustainable lodging, the lodging formats that was looking at the dependency on hotels or the dependency on short-term rentals that we have at Euromonitor. And then we were very fortunate to work with the likes of Greenview, and they provided very detailed information on water, waste, energy use, carbon footprint of full service hotels in these 99 countries that we're looking at. So again, we were able to for example, the emissions there, we were also using the Global Sustainability Tourism Dashboard, as well as other data that we have from different sources, whether it's World Bank or, the International Energy Association. So yeah, quite an extensive view of data and sources.
But basically heavily reliant on existing data sources, which I think is inevitable. It's not a criticism, Caroline, it's just a fact.
It is a fact, yes. And
You
of
only,
course,
you only
yeah,
use what other people are publishing because it's so expensive to do this kind of research globally.
that's right. So, it's not custom, it's all built on existing data.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, leveraging what we have and slicing data. So looking at the volume value relationship, using additional estimates to, as I said, for example, using United Nations data that we found on leakage for emerging markets versus developed markets. That data doesn't exist, it's just a percentage. But what we were able to do was to derive, well, what actual value is potentially leaving the country. And then we would rank that and then give each country, its rating.
That's fine. Thank you.
So I'm now delighted to share with you the leading countries from the index. And, it's not that surprising to see that Europe, in particular Scandinavia, top the list of the most sustainable countries that we found. Of course, we have Sweden as number one. It's been fairly consistent in its position, followed by Finland and then Austria. And, when we started digging in to the data and additional information that we have at Euromonitor, you can see why, for example, Scandinavia ranks so highly. So, for example, we have additional information when we asked Scandinavian travel businesses, what percentage of you are implementing a sustainable travel strategy or travel and tourism strategy, that was 65% said that they were, which is 10% higher than the global average. So, there is this increased level of engagement with sustainability, and it's that sort of practical application. Actions definitely speak louder than words.
What's intriguing for me, sorry, Caroline, could you just go back?
Yeah, sure.
What's intriguing for me about that list is that, like you, I'm not the least bit surprised to see the Scandinavian and Baltic countries right up there. What's interesting is that in the main, those countries have not made a big marketing effort around their sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whereas Slovenia, which is number 10, which is still pretty good performance, let's not kid ourselves, but they've made a great deal of their sustainability positioning in the marketplace. Just intriguing to see that not everywhere that is doing good things is necessarily yet choosing to shout about it.
I think that's as well. Again, yeah, there's many countries sort of, sort of not making the most of this. As I said at the beginning, we can see a real strong interest. It's really resonating with consumers in terms of the environment, and equally, the social aspect of sustainability after the pandemic. So yes, Slovenia is very much part and parcel of their their green campaign. But then also fundamental to the success of Europe in the ranking is the fact that they have their EU Green Deal, which was launched before the pandemic. That hasn't been sort of cast aside because of the pandemic. They're doubling down on it. There is this sense that the European destinations are gearing up more and more to meet or trying to meet the UN sustainability agenda for 2030, align with the Paris Agreement. I saw the Global Sustainable Tourism Council website email this morning, their newsletter, and more and more destinations in Europe are signing up to them, to adhere to the GSTC criteria. So again, it feels like there's momentum is moving in the right way.
Yeah, thank you.
So, yep, just to dig into Sweden a little bit more. So it's #1 in the index, but you can see that, for environmental sustainability, they're positioned 15 in the 15th position. They're doing really well in sustainable tourism demand because they have a good balance between their domestic spending and their international spending. And equally, they have a very strong focus that starts with, the national level policy to become a carbon-free country, to embrace the circular economy, to look after the Arctic and the permafrost and reduce the global warming. So it's a very holistic approach, and I think it's that joined up thinking that is really very nice to see in the Sweden example. And equally, you can see that it's wearing off on consumers. Obviously, they have very proactive advocate for sustainability with Greta Thunberg. But equally, 39% of Swedish consumers say that, this year that they would boycott brands, and that includes destinations that do not align with their beliefs and values. So there's a strong alignment that seems to go across so many aspects of as I say, Sweden policy, culture, and that joined up thinking.
What's also striking about that is that Sweden has not changed in the 5 years it's been there, consistently doing those things.
That's right. Yeah. So, many countries such as Sweden have been on this journey for many decades. But I think it is important that, and maybe if I go to this next slide, these are the movers and shakers in the index. And, you can be in the top 20, like the Netherlands, and still continue to make good progress.
Yeah.
Looking at 57 indicators across 6 years, you can see that there is room for improvement. And even in Sweden, some areas they weren't sort of appearing in the top 10. So every country has this opportunity to make improvement. For example, I saw that for example, we have Costa Rica, which is a sustainable tourism sort of pioneer, and it ranks 61st. But at the same time, some elements are, it's just outstanding in what it's done with, its green taxes, plowing that money back into preserving the environment, the rainforest, and doubling their rainforest coverage. This was just truly, impressive that this long-term view does bear results. But even around the world, whether you're in Africa or the Caribbean, we can see countries making strong progress in different areas, such as Jamaica and sustainable lodging, tourism demand, and driving that sort of value creation. Equally, we have this other view of what travel businesses are doing. So I pulled some of this information that we have, and we look at all of the companies and countries that we work with at Euromonitor. And travel falls short in its level of engagement in so many different areas compared to other industries. We can see that they're not as committed to their environmental strategies. It might be over 50%, but in other industries over 60. There's always this 10% gap. We see that over 50% of other industries are purpose driven, putting people, planet, and profit on a par. Over 20% say that their CEO is a sustainability champion. That's not the case in travel, only 14%. So as I said, there are lots of great case studies, but it's not consistent. And of course, we have pioneers like Intrepid that are going from B Corp to science-based targets. We have initiatives, whether it's the Future of Tourism Coalition or Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency. You can see the industry coming together. And I think that's what travel does so well, is this partnership and collaboration.
But those bar charts are really quite damning, aren't they? For an industry which is reliant so heavily on the cultural authenticity and the environmental quality, it is extraordinary that the CEOs of companies are reported, that so few of those CEOs are reported to be sustainability activists.
Yeah, and I think it does come down to leadership. You know, when you look at the, say, for example, Unilever, that have been on this sort of sustainability path for the last decade or more, they very much, that was, you know, everything was driven by the CEO, and it just infiltrated every aspect of business, and they continue to transform. And you know, but you have to start somewhere, and I think it's even just those small steps, and just admitting that there needs to be a change in mindset, there needs to be a change in leadership, or the mindset of the leadership, and to combine, you know, we all know about digital transformation as the future, but equally, if you can combine and converge that with that sustainable transformation, that's even better.
Yeah, but it seems to me that without the CEO commitment, then these things don't get into the KPIs, and without them being in the individual's key performance indicators when they're being judged by other criteria, inevitably the sustainability issues become less important, don't they?
Well, what we're seeing is the sort of greater level of sort of activism from investors.
Yes.
And that is really something to watch, because, you know, if the investor community really, signs up for the climate action, etc., all these campaigns, the top 100, you know, there's so many of them, but, you know, we that is going to be, that's going to usher fundamental change, and if you don't embrace it, you won't have access to funds.
Yeah.
And so there, you know, that's also something that's coming down the pipeline, and you know, that will make or break companies in the future.
Caroline, maybe that's something you and I could look at for another panel, perhaps at WTM this year, actually talking to some of the investment companies about how
Yeah.
they see the travel and tourism sector.
Yeah, and we work a lot with investment side as well. So, you know, I know that even this index that we've published, it's also being looked at by the investor community. It's not just, you know, the destinations and the travel brands. And, you know, the ESG criteria, often there's, you know, this has been in place for many years, but it does, you know, again, we're seeing that sort of shift in interest in making sure that that actually happens, avoiding greenwashing, and you know, making positive change. And that I feel that the investment community, as I said, is something to watch and to be very aware of.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So here we have some interesting pillars of interest. So, you know, the environmental sustainability pillar, why does it matter? What we found is for many consumers, you know, climate change and the environment is the first way to understand sustainability, because it is a very broad topic. And, you know, it's that entry point that people can relate to. And I think with COVID as well, we saw, you know, with planes grounded, with, you know, no traffic, etc. You know, we saw dolphins swimming by Venice. We saw, you know, the return of nature to beautiful locations that usually are overwhelmed by people. So, you know, nature was given this sort of new lease of life. And I think this is also the fact that people, after lockdown, the first thing that they really wanted to do was to get back to nature, you know, to go camping, to go for a trek or a walk, you know, in the mountains or on the beach. And it does feel that everybody has a sense of how important nature is, in addition to family, friends, and, you know, people in general. So these were the different areas that we looked at. So climate, natural assets, for example, how much of a country was protected. And that's where we saw, you know, Finland and Slovenia rank quite high because of their, you know, their level of forestry. Equally, we're looking at things like pollution and CO2 and the concentration in the air, along with, you know, final energy, and just the how much of a investment is there coming in renewables. And of course, you know, all this data comes from our sustainability system. And, you know, we worked very closely with our expert there. So, you know, as I said, climate change is that key story. And Harold, you mentioned this to me earlier, that, you know, carbon and climate, you know, that is the number one concern. So we know that consumers continue to be concerned about the, you know, the climate change emergency. However, we do have this disconnect because travel companies, only 50% of them are actually working actively to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, there's also the sense that, you know, this is expensive. If, you know, we can see that 127 billion was lost to natural disasters globally in 2020. So it's also very costly if we don't tackle this.
Yeah, but the problem, Caroline, with that, if we just go back, the problem
Mhm.
is that 127 billion loss doesn't really fall on the travel and tourism industry, does it? It falls on the international insurance system and upon communities who have to repair the damage which is done by this environmental. And one of the big trade-offs, I think, for the future is going to be between those destinations seriously threatened by climate change and their need to get international visitors. That's really to be trapped between a rock and a hard place if you run one of those destinations.
Mm. Yes,
Sorry to interrupt.
yeah, no, that's an absolutely sort of great point to make, that it is the communities that ultimately suffer the damage and then also have to pay in some way to recover. So yeah, it's very, very challenging.
And it's for the poorest in those societies that it's an uninsured risk.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
wealthy businesses which are insured just call on their insurance and put it right. But for the communities who live around them, the neighbours and so on, it's a much more disastrous impact. And we saw that first with the tsunami, the impact that had on local communities.
And I think in a way it is also a challenge that the travel industry should address, is that level of informality in the industry, which is very high. So yeah, maybe building in more sort of controls and checks and balances to make sure that, you know, those local communities that they're active in are also protected.
Yeah, let's hope.
Yes. Okay. And then sustainable tourism demand, as I mentioned, this you asked me about earlier. So this was looking at, you know, looking at resilience. So how can you tap into domestic tourism? Is there, you know, is it driving enough value, and how does that compare to international tourism? And then, of course, you know, this concern that if you just are open to day trips or, you know, day trippers, that revenue doesn't stay in the community. You know, I was on a panel last week with Croatia, and they were saying that they've surveyed residents in Dubrovnik, and they are keen to see all types of tourism return apart from the cruise ships, because those are day trips, and that it just causes, you know, so much congestion, and the money is, they don't see the real value of that.
Yeah.
Equally, as I mentioned, leakage, we took a stab at that, and then over tourism. And also that those water arrivals there, it was trying to get a sense of, well, how exposed are our destinations to cruise visitors? And I think, you know, what we've seen is that these mega cruise ships, you know, is there a need for them post-pandemic? And, you know, that sort of luxury, smaller vessel, you know, where they can use electric or hydrogen, those types of vessels are much more appealing, I would say, for those who really want to go and explore and have these amazing cruises to say, Antarctica or the Arctic. So we know that, you know, value and pivoting to that value-driven quality tourism model is key to, you know, building back better. We know that there is this shift to, well, not just the COVID bans and restrictions, but the fact that, you know, we're going to be restricted in how far we can travel. And so there is going to be this midterm shift to holidaying closer to home. And that also sort of means that there'll be less dependency in some countries like the States, you know, in terms of international travel and tourism. And of course, we do hope that when tourism does recover, that it won't be a race to the bottom in terms of discounting and pricing, and that they, they will hold steady to, as I said, to make sure that they're driving as much revenue to those destinations and communities, because ultimately they won't have the volume, so they have to find value elsewhere.
Sorry, Caroline, if you just go back, that
Sure.
that 1 to 6 figure for 2021,
Mm-hmm.
do you have similar data for previous years? Or is
Yes.
that, and maybe at some point, not there, we could perhaps share that, because I think it's an extraordinarily interesting way of looking at what the travel trends are longer
Yeah.
term.
I would say I feel that this pandemic has really sort of brought domestic tourism to the fore. It was an area that wasn't always well documented, but actually it is so vital to communities. And I think it was almost like the Cinderella of the
Yeah,
industry,
it
that
was.
people were taking it for, for granted, that we'll always have our domestic tourism, but ultimately international is a star because they'll spend more. But actually we should be trying to, elevate the domestic experience as well.
What worries me though, Caroline, is the position that somewhere like the Gambia is, or a small island in the Caribbean, where there's almost no domestic tourism realistically, because the place is small and the industry is very, very reliant there on the international visitor.
Well, we know that, where countries can, they should, but equally it's also about, raising everybody up within the region as well. So the intra-regional sort
Yeah,
of
this is,
travel is so vital. So yeah, again, it's that sort of taking that community view, and also just having that balance. And I know that some destinations are truly dependent on international travel,
yeah,
like we see with Palau. But the way that they're doing it, aiming to be carbon zero, making visitors take a pledge to tread lightly, to be respectful, to be mindful, asking them to track their carbon while they're there, taking a view of food supply, and just having that holistic view, so that yes, we are dependent on air travel, but we will also derive the most and optimize what we can from the situation.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So yeah, we do have some examples of best practice. Iceland, it has had its challenges. It had this enormous boom last decade, and continues to be very, very popular. But we can see this again, this transition being much more sort of driven by sustainability. This Hidden Iceland works with lots of different sort of bodies, like climate care, and to ensure that they are being as having as minimal impact on the environment as possible, and equally, making sure that the communities benefit from tourism as well. Equally, we know that, yeah, so Iceland performed extremely well in so many different categories. So social sustainability, economic sustainability, and number one for sustainable tourism demand, because of the balance between domestic and international. Equally, Hong Kong, for example, we saw that it was the number one in the environmental sustainability pillar. It's very sort of dependent on hospitality and tourism, which obviously is challenging at the time of COVID, especially when its key markets such as China was shut at one point. But again, they did this domestic focus, launched their Hello Hong Kong campaign, and provide a digital platform for residents to receive vouchers, and they could look for itineraries, and give them tips about what to do, and to rediscover their local area. So again, I like the fact that they were using their own sort of their residents, but equally offering new and fresh ideas to them.
What's extraordinary though is if Hong Kong can be number 30 in the environmental sustainability, when so much of it is a built environment and it's so dependent on air travel, it suggests to me that you didn't include the arrival transport in your index.
Well, the environmental sustainability is purely on the country level, and
Right.
it's to do with, as we saw, sort of climate, energy, and
Caroline, I'm
natural
not
assets.
criticizing. I
No,
just think
no.
that that is, for many countries and for us, if we worry about the carbon agenda, that's going to become a very critical issue, is the aviation sector.
Yeah, so we featured aviation and sustainable transport, but
Yeah,
definitely, we could look at, well, again, how do we factor into sort of general environmental sustainability?
but they're still coming 24th in sustainable transport. So extraordinary.
Yes, great. Well, again, it could be that, because their key source market has got, is so close to
It's
them.
much closer than it used to be.
Yeah,
Yeah, that may
yeah.
be. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, so Germany, we saw this sort of booking app called Meravando, offering consumers the ability to offset their cruises, and just again just being transparent about the impact of carbon. And it's great to see these examples, as we talked about, digital merged with the climate emergency agenda creates, such great examples of innovation and really resonate with consumers.
Yeah.
So Germany as well sort of performed quite well. It was ranked 36th in the index overall, particularly doing well in social sustainability. So just to summarize, so it does feel that, post-pandemic, it's been such a traumatic experience for everybody, whether, on the business side, on the community side, for those working in the industry. And it does feel that, to ensure that it doesn't feel like we'll ever go back to normal, but at the same time, for this new normal, that we'd make this important transformation to a value and quality driven tourism that protects and guarantees the long-term success of everybody in the chain. And we take that truly holistic view. We know that there's this sort of growing momentum and call for collective action. And of course, Harold, you're working with COP26. There's great opportunity for everybody to come together and to see, well, how do we really make this happen? And what I also liked about the index, we talked a bit about Palau, but every voice, every destination, whether you're the smallest or the largest destination, you all have something to say, and that everybody has examples of what works and what doesn't work, and it's about sharing that best practice. And from the consumer side, we know that it's a growing area of interest and concern. It's really resonating. And I think also engaging with consumers in a more proactive way, encouraging them to be, telling them about, the energy saved or the water use while they're in the hotel or the resort. That's the best way, so that everybody feels that they can make a positive contribution. And equally, ultimately, if you protect your environment and your communities and your natural and cultural assets, then that's you are protecting your unique selling point, your true value. And of course, that leads to a much greater sense and of a better and elevated consumer experience. And of course, post-pandemic, we really do need new ways of thinking. And so we know that many people are calling for radical change. And this index is not a silver bullet, but at least it helps people to think about travel and tourism in a different way. And it definitely helped me to do that.
Caroline, thanks for that. It's been a really great presentation, and I look forward to being able to put a link online to the report. A couple of thoughts though, as we come to the end of this. I mean, the first is that, in a sense, it seems to me that, and your examples at the end prove this, and we see it every year in the Responsible Tourism Awards, there are many destinations and many businesses and many organizations doing great things by taking responsibility to make tourism more sustainable. But the brutal reality is that they're still the minority of companies. And what's so frustrating, I think, what are we now? We're nearly 50 years on from the first Man in the Environment conference in 1972, when I was much younger. It's a long period of time that we've known this crisis was coming. And whilst we now have solutions, still they're only being implemented by a minority of businesses and a minority of destinations. And that seems to me to be the next big challenge, which leads me on to ask you the question I want to ask, which is, I quite understand that most of what you've been able to do is based on secondary data, which is inevitable if you try and do something on the scale that you're doing. It's not a criticism, it's simply a fact. It's the only way it can be done. But I wonder whether we couldn't begin to look at just a few destinations and see what a destination could do to stand up the claim. So I think about Cape Town when I was there for WTM Africa, height of the water shortages and the drought. I could not find out which hotels had the best water conservation policies. And it seems to me, given what you demonstrated about the demand globally, for me, that's the really big takeaway from your paper. The demand is there, but how on earth do we empower the consumer to make sensible decisions? And that can only be done, I think, if hotels, tour operators, destinations actually publish data on what they've really achieved rather than just more relabeling, which we're still seeing loads of. You know, tourism declares, the future tourism, all the rest of it. They're just new labels. There's not much substance and there's not much evidence of people actually taking responsibility, which is what we need to see. I don't know if that's something we might work together on in terms of focusing more on enabling consumers at the local level to make informed choices.
Yeah, that sounds, really, really interesting to delve in and see, well, what are the precise metrics? And the other thing is, it shouldn't be sort of too complicated. It needs to be simple. Otherwise, it can't be implemented at that local level or scaled up. So the simpler we can approach this, I feel the better.
Yeah, and much of it is actually simple. It's been made complicated by the consultants who see value in the work they do in terms of collecting it. But water consumption, electricity, local spend. Local spend is just a bookkeeping mechanism. Electricity and water are generally very easy. You put meters on them and the meters are cheap. So I think we might be able to make progress on this, Caroline. But can I just say a really big thank you? That was an excellent conversation that you and I have managed to have around your excellent report. I look forward very much to debating it, no doubt, with lots of people as more people become familiar with it. But thanks very much for your time today.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation and look forward to working together in the future.
Thanks very much, Caroline.